country of ours has been around for hundreds of years.
We've had 45 presidents.
Some of them have been assassinated.
Some of them have survived assassinations.
The ones who haven't had an assassination attempt on them all have one thing in common.
They were Freemasons.
Yes, you heard them correctly. The Freemasons, do they run America? We'll be investigating that today.
Well, let's start off with what we know. The Freemasons were a society founded in England by 4 English lodgers, and they're feared because they're an all-male society with about 6 million members, many of which are very powerful.
There are many theories and mysteries surrounding the Freemasons, especially in America. Let's talk about the evidence that supports the idea that the Freemasons do, in fact, run our country. First, we have the founding fathers themselves. Many of the most notable founding fathers were honorary Freemasons, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Monroe, John Hay, John Hancock, Paul Revere, John Paul Jones, and James Otis. Between 9 to 13 signers of the Constitution and 9 signers of the Declaration of Independence, and 33 of the 74 generals in the colonial army were Freemasons. There is no doubt that the Freemasonry had influence and power in the US government from the start. There is also evidence of popular United States symbols, sayings, and even architecture. Take the dollar bill, for example. We're all familiar with the all-seeing eye. It is the commonly recognized as the eye of God in the reference to saying, "In God we trust." However, this is also a common symbol known by Freemasons as the eye of providence. George Washington was even sworn in office with a Masonic Bible, which has since been used for multiple other presidential inaugurations. Last but certainly not least, doesn't make sense.
Last but certainly not least, even the layout of the streets of Washington, D.C. indicate Masonic influence. Look familiar? Yes, those are the most profound symbols of the Masons, the compasses and the squares next to the Order of the Eastern Star. There is no doubt that these street shapes were intentionally designed in the framework of our country's capital. And is it any coincidence that the Illuminati, an organization commonly associated with the Freemasons, was established in 1776, only months before the Declaration of Independence was signed?
So can you describe the role of George Washington in the Freemasons?
Well, that's easy. He played a huge fundamental part in our society.
George Washington was the first president of the United States. He just also happened to be a Freemason. This is obviously not a coincidence. The Freemasonry had to make a bold statement in order to establish their presence in the United States. On top of that, George Washington became a Master Mason, the highest ranking Freemason, at the age of 21 on August 4th, 1753. He became the Master Mason 22 years before the Revolutionary War started, and 23 years before the Declaration of Independence was written. The Freemasonry did this to prepare Washington to lead the country they are putting together. With the 20 plus years of training, Washington was able to look out what works and what doesn't work. So when he became president, boom, he was able to give the country a great jump start.
England is the origin of the Freemason Guild. In 1812, the British and Americans went to war, while James Monroe, another Freemason, was president. Then after the war ended came the bloodiest battle, the Battle of New Orleans. The battle was a massive failure for the British and made the general a hero in America. That hero was Andrew Jackson, and that battle carried him all the way to the presidency. That's why the British threw the battle and forgot to bring ladders to get over the American fort.
So there are many conspiracy theories surrounding the Freemasons and the Freemasonry. How do you respond to that?
Well, people will believe what they want to believe, but if you want answers, take a look at Andrew Jackson.
If we begin with the earliest president to have an assassination attempt on them, we'll have to start with Andrew Jackson. Sure, he was a Freemason, but if you look at the details of it, the assassin fired 2 flintlock pistols that both misfired.
Oh, you are done now, Floyd!
The odds of both pistols misfiring was determined to be 1 in 125,000. Other important details of the attempt is the assassin, Richard Lawrence, was an unemployed house painter who had no connections to Jackson's political rivals. The year before the attempted assassination, Jackson had successfully dismantled the Bank of the United States. The assassin was determined to be mentally ill and spent the rest of his life in a mental institution.
Okay, Andrew Jackson's assassination was weird and strange, so what?
Well, Andrew Jackson wasn't the only one with a strange assassination attempt. I mean, look at Lincoln. He's so dumb, he went to the theater in the first place.
Lincoln's assassination is very interesting. The Freemasonry wanted to start with a new America, so they got the South to secede from the North. This caused the Civil War. A war that should have lasted 6 months but lasted 4 years. Why did it last so much longer than it should have? It's because the Freemasonry got involved and sabotaged the Union at every turn. The Freemasonry had convinced France to join the side of the Confederate Army, but when Lincoln passed the Emancipation Proclamation, France stepped out. So the Freemasons got together to figure out the next move. They figured that their next move was to sabotage the Union at every turn and support the Confederate whenever possible. After Lincoln put the country back together successfully, the Freemasonry hired John Wilkes Booth to assassinate Lincoln.
Man, I gotta go to the bathroom.
Thanks, man.
So they can tear apart the country again. Lincoln's vice president was Andrew Johnson, and Andrew Johnson was a Freemason, just so happened. So it would only make sense to have Lincoln assassinated so John could fix what Lincoln broke. They tried their hardest but eventually failed and tried to cut their losses and roll into Reconstruction of the new great America. This is why Reconstruction went so horribly. The Freemasonry eventually adopted to the huge and united America. So now you can see why the Freemasonry obviously controls America.
Okay, and what about McKinley? There are a ton of conspiracy theories about McKinley being a Freemason. Can you explain that?
Well, McKinley, he was a real Freemason. What would you expect? In fact, let's talk about McKinley.
Around 1897, William McKinley, another Freemason, was made the 25th President of the United States of America. He did this with great support from the robber barons. Many robber barons such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Cornelius Vanderbilt supported McKinley as he would support them economically. However, the Freemasons had a problem. These robber barons had no affiliation with the Freemasons. However, they acquired vast amount of wealth, and with this, an enormous amount of power. That was a big problem for the Guild, so they decided to break up the monopolies that formed. The Guild managed to get the barons to support Theodore Roosevelt, a Freemason, to be Vice President of the United States, as a keep your enemies close ploy to keep him busy. Then McKinley was killed for the security of the Freemason Guild. Theodore Roosevelt replaced him and broke up the monopolies. While the robber barons' wealth increased, the confrontation decreased as their absolute power was dissolved. Then, Theodore Roosevelt set aside almost 150 million acres of lands as national parks for the Guild to use to hide themselves. They created the world's largest vault inside Mount Rushmore and their secret headquarters in Half Dome.
Sure, McKinley was suspicious, but that doesn't prove anything.
Well, take a look 7 years later at JFK. I mean, he was stupid enough to sit in the back of a convertible that was open.
In 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated after only 2 years of presidency due to his lack of cooperation with the Freemasons. Who wanted to initiate immediate war with both the Soviets and Cubans. With the Cold War going on at the same time and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, he could have easily done so. However, when JFK refused and even exposed the Freemasons' plot for New World Order, but only vaguely, the public didn't even pick up the hint in his speeches. Conveniently, Kennedy was assassinated only a year later, and the obstacle in the Freemasons' way to power was removed. The entire operation was dubbed the Big Event, and the public believed Lee Harvey Oswald was behind it. But how could he? Oswald had no training in weaponry previous to the event, yet his aim to kill the president was perfect. The reality is an unknown Freemason agent led the assassination and another drove the vehicle, and they all set up Oswald to cover the Freemasons' tracks. Supposedly, the weapon Oswald used fired in 6 seconds, but the weapon wasn't mechanically quick enough to do so, and even when high-trained US soldiers have tried to replicate it, they have unable to replicate the shot. He was framed to be a communist, and that was believed to be the reason for why he shot JFK.
So how about one of my favorites, Reagan? Can you tell me about his assassination attempt?
Reagan, we don't like to talk about him anymore, but given the circumstances, I guess I can make an exception.
Now we get to Reagan, the great communicator. He was not a Freemason during his presidency. He had an attempted assassination against him. also have to realize that Reagan's predecessor, George H.W. George Bush, was not a Freemason, but just like Reagan, he happened to have an assassination attempt on him. 2 years after the assassination attempt, Reagan became part of the Freemasonry. This is obviously not a coincidence. Reagan was living in fear of another attempt and eventually gave in to the pressure.
So let's go back to World War II. How many officers and generals were Freemasons?
Well, I'm not at liberty to say that.
During World War II, almost every general was a Freemason. They all prospered and survived while Patton suffered a freak accident. While driving with some associates, their car was sandwiched between two others. Nobody in the car was hurt except Patton. He had smashed his head on the privacy divider in the vehicle. He was taken to the hospital with a mild concussion. However, he died. The Freemasons blamed the incident on the newfound enemy, the Soviets. But considering all the other generals survived, not including him, and everyone served with him like Douglas MacArthur, James Harold Doolittle, Omar Bradley, Bernard Montgomery were all Freemasons, it's very hard to consider this the truth.
Many of the most notable founding fathers. Last but certainly not least. What? That doesn't make sense.
Last but certainly not least. Have you never heard that saying before?
I haven't.
Okay.
Last but certainly not least. Doesn't make sense.
Last but certainly not least, even the layout of streets of Washington, D.C. indicate Masonic influence.
You're an idiot.
Where the fucking asterisks?
Masonic influence. Show satellite image with drawn line.
You should have put Lincoln's assassination is very interesting. The Freemasonry wanted to start a new America. I can smell your feet.
Oh my god.
Stand up, Isaac!
That was big problem for the as a keep your enemies close ploy to keep him. I hate my life. I didn't say
It's free real estate.
Assassination.
Great.
He just also happened, boom. He was able to.
Oh my god.
during World War II, almost every general was a Freemason.
Man, I gotta go to the bathroom.
Oh, thanks, man.